do have to interrupt. I was asked an interesting question, and this is a show of hands question. How many folks out there, well, if you have hands, just go ahead and throw them up. But how many folks out there have actually ridden the V&T back when it was the V&T, before 1950?
Right here.
Hands in the air.
Right here.
Excellent.
3 days on it.
Why don't they give a talk?
Why don't they give a talk? Hard has.
I'll wrap up quickly so you can talk about your experiences. Wanted to thank you all for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk about the Lion. Like a lot of you, I first learned about the Lion at this conference. I was attending the dinner. I got there a little bit late, so I sat at the back table where Stan Gentry was sitting, and I had heard rumors about some crazy guy in Iowa who was building the Virginia and Truckee's first locomotive, and I thought, yeah, you know, I'm building locomotives too. I've got drawings, and I've got really nothing to show for it. And I was stunned when he got up there and showed photographs of a frame and of wheels, and I, at that point, was hooked. I think at that point in time, Stan was still the owner of the Lion, but since then, the Lion's kind of gone through a twisting path like a lot of us have. And right now, the Lion is actually owned by a museum. It's owned by the Mason City and Clear Lake Electric Railway Historical Society, which does business as the Iowa Trolley Park and also as the V&T Lion. A lot of people might ask, why does the Mason City and Clear Lake Electric Railway Historical Society have the Lion? And the short answer is because the entity was in existence and we needed a nonprofit to be able to handle the completion of the construction of this locomotive. And Stan Gentry had a long association with that society and donated the locomotive to it. It's got a board of directors of about 8 people that are in control of the museum. It's a 501c3 organization, so really what we've been doing over about the last 8 years is applying for grants, fundraising, etc., so that we can fund the completion of the locomotive. I think it's been about 5 years since we've had an update talk on it, so we've got a couple of things that we've completed in that time, really 4 major things: the tender braking system, painting the tender tank, working on the Smokebox front, and the biggest and best, I think, is the boiler being completed, and we'll talk about each of those things as we go along. And if anybody has questions as I'm going through the slides, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll do my best to answer them, and I'll also reserve some time at the end for questions as well. One of the challenges with the Lion is, as most of you probably know, there are no photographs in existence of the Lion when it was in operating condition. And there are only about 12 total photographs of the Lion that are in existence, and all of them are when it's essentially a derelict wreck parked in the weeds out and about Carson City. There is one drawing of the locomotive that survived the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire that's kept in the archives of the California State Railroad Museum. That is a plan view of the locomotive, not of the tender. There are some tender drawings of other Union Iron Works locomotives that we're able to borrow information from. Of course, we're also able to scale off of photographs of the Lion. And we also came upon a Union Iron Works tender that was still in existence. It belonged to one of the Bodie and Benton locomotives, and the museum acquired that, and we now have that preserved under a roof. It had been sitting outside. It was a former water tank used at a cattle ranch outside Lee Lining, but it's now safely preserved. So we used all of those as sources of information for building the Lion's tender. Unlike a lot of restoration projects, a real challenge we've had is that we don't have anything to start from. There are no, as far as we know, existing parts of the Lion, so everything has to be built from scratch. So here you can see, we're looking at, on the right-hand side, the actual Lion's tender. This is one of the tender trucks. And over the last year, we've been fabricating parts of the brake system. So you go from a drawing of a brake on another Union Iron Works locomotive from that time frame, into bringing that into existence. Now, we are, as you might imagine, a pretty low-budget organization. Unlike state-sponsored museums, we don't have access to even meager tax dollars. We don't have a museum where we can really have enough of an attraction to charge people admission. So we have to get by sometimes by hook or by crook. And in this case, when we were fabricating brake beams for the locomotive's tender, we actually made friends with somebody who owned a steam-powered sawmill in Iowa. And there was a windstorm, so some oak trees had fallen over. So we asked somebody if they'd please give us their fallen oak trees, which they were happy to do. We took them over to our friends at the steam-powered sawmill and had cut up our brake beams as well as a pilot beam for the locomotive. Total cost, $0. Now there are some parts that we don't have even drawings of, we just have photographs. This is of the brake wheel on the tender tank. There aren't any, as you can imagine, up-close views of the LYON'S tender. People really aren't interested in tenders when they're out there taking photographs of derelict steam locomotives in general. So we zoom in on what we have, and what we have is this little bit fuzzy picture, but enough that we can, I think, fairly accurately interpret what we're looking at and fabricate a reasonably accurate reproduction for our 12 inches tall model. Then we're also doing classic rivet counting. So we want to make the LYON replica as accurate as possible, but when you're dealing with things like a tender and you don't have a measure drawing to go off of, you've got to look at photographs. You've got to study, well, how many rivets are attaching the brackets to the tender? And then how high up does that go on the tank so that we can come up with the size that we're going to use for our original. And in this case, the tender attachment brackets, we were able to get a blacksmith in Iowa to fabricate those, again, for free for us so that we can keep the project moving forward. And here you see Stan Gentry with his homemade rivet furnace, taking out that white thing at the end of tongs. That's a glowing hot rivet that he is taking over to the tender so that we can rivet the attachment bracket onto the tender tank. And then about a year ago, we were very happy to finally, for the first time in about 130 years, I think, unite the, actually about 100 years, unite the LYON with its tender. So we dragged it outside the main museum locomotive shed and had the LYON together with tender. What you see on it right in this photograph is not the boiler. This is a wooden mock-up of the boiler that was made so that the LYON could participate in a 4th of July parade. And that's an interesting story. It's not the first time the LYON'S boiler participated in a parade. Does anybody else know what parade the LYON'S boiler participated in back in 1869? Oh, Russell, you can't answer.
It was called to Carson City for Doritos.
You could call that a parade, but actually during the course of research for paint, so we're trying to figure out what color was the LYON, what did it look like? We were searching through old newspaper articles, and fortunately a lot of newspapers, especially historic newspapers in California, have been digitized, and you can search them using a word search. We found a mention of the parade in San Francisco to celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, so the Pacific Railroad parade. And there was an account of all of the units that marched in that parade. And they talked about the unit from the Union Iron Works, talked about their capes that they were wearing and what color they were. So I'm getting excited and thinking, we're talking about some colors with the Union Iron Works. Then they talk about the locomotive Calistoga that they had just completed, and they were dragging that throughout the streets. They talked about what the cab was made out of. So I'm very excited now. Wow, now we can maybe find out what the cab was made out of. Then they talk about the boiler of the first locomotive for the Virginia and Truckee Railroad being dragged throughout the streets of San Francisco by, I think, 4 gray mares, or 4 gray horses. And so it actually took part in the parade to celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So we wanted to keep up the tradition and have the LYON be in the parade again. And this is one of my favorite photographs. I think the last time we were here, I had this smokestack in a trailer outside so that people could see we had just completed the smokestack. So this is when it's united with the locomotive for the first time. Of course, it had to be hoisted atop that wooden boiler. But you can see the front view, that very distinctive view of the Lion with that absurdly tall smokestack. So I think that's a signature view of the Lion right there. Now the tender tank painting, this we could not have, I think, done anything remotely accurate without a lot of outside help. And many people who helped in that project are here in the room today, but I think no person helped more than Jim Wilkie. And it really started with a study of this photograph. The Lion did not have a very long service life on the Virginia and Truckee, only running from 1869 to the 1870s, and then very rarely used after that, and not used at all by 1890. So we're not sure if we're looking at any original paint in this photograph, but the overwhelming odds are that we are not. But it is the Lion, and it does have some interesting clues. We know from some of the newspaper searches that Lion was involved in an accident in which they dropped a flat car of cordwood and ran down to the Virginia City Depot to take on water. Then they ran back and forgot that they left the flat car sitting on the tracks. So the locomotive actually rear-ended a flat car, and it ended up damaging the rear of the tank. Interestingly enough, when you look at this photograph, you notice that all this paint looks like it's in pretty bad shape, but if you look at the rear of the tender, it looks a little bit different. Maybe that's evidence of a paint job repair. That could be used to support that perhaps this was a touch-up of an earlier paint job. We just don't know. But one thing we do know is that the Union Iron Works, when they were building locomotives, was working about 5 to 10 years behind the times. So what we see is a paint job that's really not necessarily typical of locomotives that would have been built in the East in 1869 or in the early 1870s, but something that's maybe more representative of the late 1850s or the early 1860s. So we try to look at some of the examples of locomotives from that time. We also know that the Union Iron Works was doing a fairly good job of copying Danforth locomotives. And so we try to glean clues from what Danforth locomotives were painted like during that time. So this is what we came up with and painted it on. There's always a lot of room for debate, unfortunately, since we did not have the good fortune yet of discovering that color painting of the Lion that's maybe in somebody's basement in Carson City. And of course, there's no color photographs. So this is really an interpretation based on a lot of different sources of information that are available to us, but this is the best guess that we could come up with what it looked like. And then there, I think, are some artistic licenses taken every now and then when you're doing a project like this. And I think one area is shading on the letters and outlining letters. You know, would a freight locomotive or a construction locomotive like the Lion necessarily have gold leaf bordering the lettering on the tender tank? Maybe not, probably not, but it happened.
I just want to make it absolutely clear that I did not specify gold leaf on that.
That's right. That's right. That was the painter taking license with putting the gold leaf on there. But Jim Jim is a warrior for the truth on locomotives. And unfortunately, there are opposing forces. There are people who like things like red and gold. And so eventually, I think when the Lion's tender tank is repainted, that gold will probably disappear. Then another interesting challenge with the Lion is that there are no Lucius Beebe wedge shots of the Lion coming at you so that you can see what the front of the locomotive looks like. They're all profile views, or you maybe have somewhat of a partial view of the front, but not enough for you really to glean a lot of detail about what it looked like. So again, we are going to other sources of information. So we have Lyon's identical twin sister, the Ormsby, which we do have a somewhat front view. Unfortunately, it's not a very high quality photograph, so we can't gain a lot of information from the front view in that photo. Then we also will look at front views of locomotives that we know were built contemporaneously with the Lion at the Union Iron Works. And here's the locomotive that came after the V&T order. This is the Ralston. We see a very interesting front on this locomotive. You may, when you think about locomotives, there are generally two styles of securing the front of the smokebox door. The most common one that most of us are probably familiar with is to use something called door dogs. So that's a little series of bolts that attach a foot to the door that holds it tight. Then there's also an interior lock, so that's more or less of an English style where you've got a handle in the center, and there's a couple of arms inside that retract, and then you can pull the door open. And then you have this oddball style on the Ralston, which is actually no latch at all. They're just two hinges, two sets of hinges. So if you wanted to open this smokebox door, you'd have to drive out the hinge pins on one side so that you could open it up. So looking at all this is a really unique design, I think, for Union Iron Works, not commonly used by a lot of other locomotive builders. So we try to arrive at, well, what do we think might have been used on the Lion? This is kind of what we settled on. It's a hybrid of the two views. So in the view of Ormsby as Mountaineer at Lake Tahoe, we see what looks to be a fairly plain door. And of course, on the Ralston photograph, more decoration. You've got a raised half edge, and you've also got the name and place of construction and year of construction cast into the door on that locomotive. So rather than duplicate the dual hinges, we decided to go with a more traditional set of hinges on one side, but we picked up the rest of the design from the Ralston locomotive. So you can see these are fairly large castings. That's a standard size pallet that the smokebox door ring is sitting on. That's about a 400 to 500 pound cast iron piece. And then that door, because of a pattern making error, weighs almost as much. It's a very, very thick casting. Yeah, one of you has one of those doors. And then, as I said again, we don't have a lot of the resources that state-funded museums have, or even that some of the upper-tier private museums have. So we've got a locomotive shop with some machine tools in Iowa, and then we've got a machine shop in Burbank, California. This is machining the hinges for the front of the Lion on a standard Bridgeport knee mill. So these parts far exceed the normal rating for that machine. So you see some interesting work support going on here. So this, in the center, this is our shop crane hanging overhead, which is holding onto the door so that it doesn't sag too much. Underneath all of this piece, it's not all that visible in the photograph, is about $200 worth of aluminum that's been specially machined to extend out the table on our mill so that we can support the piece. So this is used to machine all of the door surfaces, to machine the door ring, including the about 45-inch diameter circle for all the attachment bolt holes that go around the outside. You can see we're a little excited when we finally got it all together and were able to open the door for the first time. And then this is the finished product. So what we went with is, rather than door dogs, which really would have mucked up this decoration around the rim of both the smokebox door ring and the door itself, we went with the center style latching mechanism. So all the latch mechanism is actually on the opposite side of this door. So you turn it 90 degrees clockwise, and that's open, and then you can open the door. And then, of course, we did a number plate because there is a photograph of the Lion when it's on the scrap track with the remains of the Ormsby, and you can see in shadow evidence of a number plate. You can't tell what, if anything, it says on it, but you can tell that there was a number plate on the locomotive. We will never know probably what that plate looked like exactly, but we can see that there would be evidence of it. And we know that on a busy railroad like the Virginia and Truckee, it would be important for you to be able to identify trains coming at you, and you would do that by being able to identify the locomotive at the front of them. So we can only surmise that at some point, either when it was constructed or afterward, a number plate was added to the locomotive. So that's why we've decided to replicate that here. The number 1 on the center, that's just a mock-up. We're still trying to figure out what exactly that decoration will look like on the locomotive. But there are a lot of options with locomotives from this time frame. One of the concepts that Jim had detailed for us was even that this door would be a different color than the door ring. That some locomotives during this time period would have had a color that matched the frame or matched other parts of the locomotive. So in the case of the Lion with a green frame, it's entirely justifiable that you might have a door that would be green on the inside, and perhaps some of these raised decorations on the outside might have a stripe on them as well of a different color. But for the time being, we're going with black. That's a conservative choice, I think. Then the next big thing is the last thing that we've been working on, and I think it's the most important for the project. When the line was begun back in the 80s, in the drawing phase, money was really not an object. These days, when you want to build a pressure vessel, money becomes a real problem. And we're talking about a locomotive that we want to be able to run anywhere. So it has to be FRA certified. So that means we have to build it to the highest standards. All the material has to have careful documentation. It all has to be up to the highest material standards. There have to be inspections. Well, when the money ran out for this as a private project, the boiler project really died in its tracks. And it sat around really just as about a 30% complete boiler for over 10 years. So it's very important for us to try to raise money to finish the LYON'S boiler, and 2 things happened that made that possible. I think the first thing is Stan Gentry met Dave Clokey. I think you all either know Dave or know of Dave, a fantastic builder of locomotives. He built his own Leviathan replica and then built the York 17 locomotive that's out there starring in the East Coast. Dave has the qualification to build boilers. Dave also has some really amazing friends, and Fred Haberkamp is one of them. He was out here, I think, about 5 years ago. Fred is an extraordinarily generous man, and he donated the money that it took to get the LYON'S boiler done. So Fred, working in conjunction with Dave and the rest of us who are working on the project, were really able to get the LYON'S boiler moving again. So here we see the boiler getting the firebox attached to it, so you can tell what's new and what's been around for a long time, because what's been around is rusted and what's new is not. And so this is in Dave Clokey's shop, and we're fitting up the Smokebox for attachment, or not the Smokebox, but the firebox. Does anybody know what this is a photograph of? This is a photograph of controversy. Back when the LYON'S boiler was originally designed, it was going to be constructed by the Strasburg Railroad. And a man named Lynn Boedinger, who you might know, designed the boiler. And when we weren't really that concerned about how much it would cost to build the boiler, we thought, wouldn't it be great to try to duplicate the LYON'S boiler as much as reasonably possible with the modern safety requirements? We know from drawings that the original LYON had a crown bar boiler. And what a crown bar is traditionally, or not traditionally, but for the modern steam locomotives, their boilers they have what are called radial stays. They're straight pieces of metal that go down from the outer shell into the crown sheet, which is the sheet of the boiler that sits right above the fire. And that's how it's held in place. That wasn't always the way they were constructed. They did use crown bars at one time. So that's a thick bar that runs across the top of the crown sheet, and then it has some slings, and what we see here are the slings. These are tack welded to the top of the wagon top part of the boiler, and they're held in place. So the boiler was designed to be a crown bar boiler. All the material was bought and cut for it to be a crown bar boiler. And then we start the project up again, and it turns out that building a crown bar boiler is difficult and it's expensive. And it's a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive than doing a radially stayed crown sheet. But because we had the parts, and because we're trying to replicate the line as best we can, we went forward with that. That's caused a little bit of debate about whether that was the right move or not, but that's the boiler we have, is now a crown bar boiler. Another thing about restoration versus reconstruction. When you do a restoration, one of the first things you do with the boiler is, you've seen them where they'll draw a grid on the boiler and they'll determine how thick is the metal, what needs to be replaced. You'll go through, you can test all the stay bolts to see which stay bolts are broken or which ones are too eroded and they need to be replaced. And that can result in some pretty difficult work, replacing sometimes dozens or even 100 stay bolts. You've seen that on the Glenbrook project that Chris has been completing. When you build a locomotive from scratch, every stay bolt has to be, first of all, made and then installed. You can't go down to STAYBOLT R Us or Boilers R Us or the Boiler Mart and buy any of these parts. So the Lion has over 300 stay bolts in it, even though it's a small boiler. So every one of these requires a certain amount of handwork. This stage, the boiler's been tipped on its side so that the workmen can more easily get to the stay bolts that stay the sides of the boiler. So this is a photograph. That's a magnetic drill. So that's a drill that's got giant magnets on the bottom that you can turn on and off so that it stays steady on the boiler. And then we're reaming out every single one of those holes so that it's the exact dimension it needs to be. Then what will come in afterward is every one of those will be threaded. And they have to be threaded through both of the holes so that the stay bolts can be installed. So another difference between modern construction and period construction is, if you were building a boiler from scratch these days, you would probably weld in the stay bolts. It's a great labor-saving device. Because the Lion had originally threaded stay bolts, it would have been hammered over. We replicated that. Again, adds substantially to the cost involved in doing it. So here you see they're getting ready to hammer over stay bolts. It's probably a little bit of overkill here, but you have a hydraulic jack that supports the back of the stay bolt. This is a hydraulic hammer. Somebody has to come through and individually hammer over the head of every single one of those stay bolts to mushroom the stay bolt out and to fill up all the space in the threads and to make a watertight seal. This is attaching the mud ring, which is a thick piece of steel that's the very bottom part of the firebox. This is hot riveted, so you've got a rivet furnace that's out of the photograph. Take the hot rivet, put it into the hole, and then you're forming the head on one side with the hydraulic hammer and keeping the other head in place on the bottom with another hydraulic tool on that side. Fortunately, there's only about 100 of those rivets that needed to go in. This is probably what added the most cost to the Lion boilers. Anybody know what we're looking at here? And I'll just tell you right now, it's not an EKG for the boiler.
Hydrostatic pressure test.
No, that's a good guess. What it is it's heat treating. So when you build a boiler and you weld it, welds result in dramatic differences in heat while the welding process is going on. And that creates stresses in the metal. And so you're required when you're building a pressure vessel to relieve those stresses. And so the way you do that is you take the entire boiler, and they still do this with other large parts, and they put them into an oven where they're gradually heated up and then gradually cooled down. Well, because this is a crown bar boiler, we could not install the front tube sheet for the boiler flues until after the crown bars were all tightened down. Because when you heat treat, everything changes shape a little bit. So the bolts that are holding the crown bars over the crown sheet and holding the slings in place all loosen up a little bit. So they all have to be tightened down. So that means somebody has to go in there and do that. And so when that's all done, you can finally put that front tube sheet in. And so then somebody has to come out and do an area-specific heat treat. Cost about $25,000 to area-specific heat treat this. So what we're looking at here, these are like giant electric blankets. Outside of this building that this is in, there are 6 portable generators that are providing the electricity to power these giant electric blankets to heat up this area to relieve the stress that's remaining from when we welded in the front tube sheet. Unfortunately, while this was going on, one of the power generators failed, and that wasn't caught right away. So there was a difference in the heat, which caused that front tube sheet to warp. So we had to go in and have that all redone again. Fortunately, the second try was on the heat treater and not on the builders. So now that we've got the boiler welding is all done, it's all been heat treated, the dry pipe is in, and the dry pipe, for those of you that don't know, that's what connects the throttle to the outside of the boiler, so that there'll be pipes that will connect that to the cylinders. Actually, this weekend, flues are going in the boiler. That should be completed in a couple more weeks, so we'll have a boiler that's done. Then we're talking about a locomotive that's about 80% complete. We're really at that point talking about, in order to get the locomotive in a condition where it can run, talking about plumbing, really. I mean, the Lion right now, all of the running gear is done. So now we're talking about constructing a cab, domes. Yeah, there is a steam dome now, but there's a decorative dome cover that goes over that. And we're really, what I like to say, pushing the rock downhill now. When we didn't have the boiler done, that was such a huge fundraising obstacle that it really felt like we were pushing a really heavy rock uphill. And now that that boiler is done, the Lion project is really going to start coming together. And I hope that when I come back in a year or two, that you will maybe see some video of a locomotive getting some steam tests done. So that's the hope. And then the long-term goal, of course, is to have the Lion done by 2019, which has got some very important anniversary dates. Of course, that's the anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, but for all of us in this room, it's also the anniversary year that the Virginia and Truckee was completed, and near and dear to my heart, also the year that the Lion was completed. So we'd love nothing more than to see you all in 2019 with a completed locomotive, FRA certified, possibly chugging down the tracks of a tourist railroad near you. Any questions?
Yes.
What do you use for fuel?
It's going to burn wood, just like the original. Yep. Bill.
Will it be fitted with oil, with air brakes?
Yes. Yes, that's one of the concessions to safety that we are making in the Lion. What we will do, however, is you won't see an externally mounted air pump. The air pump, in all likelihood, is going to be mounted under the foot plate, so it will be essentially under the cab. So you'll hear it working, but it will be very difficult for you to see it.
Well, the Lion only got tender brakes, is that all you're gonna have?
Yes. Yeah, so the air pump will just power the tender brakes. We will not have brakes on the locomotive itself.
Is that the way the York and the other locomotive have been done? I wonder whether they're legal that way, that's all.
I don't know whether the other two locomotives have engine brakes or not.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry. The last question was whether the other two recently completed replica locomotives, the Leviathan and the York, whether they have locomotive brakes or whether they just have tender brakes. I'm about 95% sure that the Leviathan has locomotive brakes.
Both of them do, I think.
Jim says both of them do.
Yeah, I saw the Leviathan Saturday, it's got brakes on it.
Yeah, I remember working the brakes on that locomotive, on the independent brakes. Yes, Carrie?
Todd, your explanation about your tender and the questions about it brings to mind that there is another interesting parallel to that story. In England in 1837, the Liverpool and Manchester Railroad built a locomotive by the name of Lion. It's also known as the Titfield Thunderbolt. It still exists, it's in running condition. Unfortunately, the tender didn't survive, and there are no drawings and no pictures or etchings or anything else. Nobody has a clue what that tender looked like, so they cobbled one together in 1929. Sort of like what they had in 1837.
Fortunately, I think everybody can hear Carrie's voice, so I won't repeat this question. That's a great point. I'm glad you raised it. One of the challenges with this is I think we spend more time debating what something should look like or what something should be made out of or what size it should be than we do actually building the part. There's just, I think in the number plate, I probably have 100 emails back and forth among various people about what the number plate should look like. And Jim helped a lot with that. I think we went through about 3 different mock-ups of what the number plate should look like.
Not yet.
It's just everything, because we're trying to be as true to history as we can with the limited information we have. So that gives you lots of room for debate. And as you all know, railroad historians love a good debate. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you said you're gonna put the tubes in the boiler?
Yes.
Before you finish the locomotive?
Yes.
Why would you do that? The clock starts for the FRA when you put the tubes in.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. That's been another area of debate. The reason we're doing it is that there is a revision in the boiler code coming down the pike. And if we were to wait to tube the boiler until later, we may be subject to that new code because we're new construction. So we need to have the boiler completed within the effective date of the current code. And in order to have that boiler deemed completed, it has to undergo a hydrostatic test. So we have to have the tubes in it. So the clock will start running. For those of you who aren't up to speed on it, the Federal Railroad Administration has rules governing how long boiler tubes can be in a locomotive, regardless of how much you run it. You could have a locomotive with a brand new boiler that sits there, and if it sits there for too many years, even though you never run it one time, you have to take the boiler tubes out, renew the ends, and then put them back in again. So the reason we're doing it is because of that change in the boiler code.
Good answer, okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
We've
Yes.
verified driver brakes on the Leviathan and New York photos.
There you have it, the definitive source.
Wi-Fi is your friend.
Everything you read on the internet is true.
Photos don't lie.
When
Oh,
you
yes,
talk,
they do.
when you talk about that heat treat, that's a stress relief for the welding. It's a metallurgist, I think we'd call it an anneal. What was the temperature that you, at first it was done in a furnace? You said the first one, and then you come back with the heat blankets and do it.
Yeah, there's, I don't know what the temperature was, is the short answer to your question. I think the second part, if I may call it that, has to do with furnace versus the blankets.
Right.
When you send it to a furnace, you get charged by the pound. It's the way it works. They charge you to heat treat it by the pound that goes in that furnace. So it's actually saved a little bit of money rather than having to go through heat treat twice in the furnace to have them come out and do a mobile
Do
heat
the
treat.
blankets, yeah.
That's right.
Well, there's a lot of things set up to do blankets too. It's very common
Yeah,
technology.
just not so common for them to do it on locomotive boilers, but it's
Yeah, on little trivial things like aircraft, for example.
yes. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Last thing, I would encourage all of you to follow along. We have regular updates posted to our Facebook page. You can friend us. It's VTLYON, VTLYON, on Facebook. You can also go to our website, vtlyon.org, and follow us there. We've got links to the progress of each of the various components that's being worked on. I think, though, Facebook is your best bet. For those of you who are technologically inclined, you can take a picture of our QR code. That'll lead you to the website as well. Thank you very much.